Hello and welcome to our presentation on the life and sacrifice of Dr. George Robert Grasett and the Canadian Caregivers who responded to Irish famine migrants when they arrived in Toronto in 1847 and the ancestors who survived the ordeal. Grasett Park will open on the 16th of July this year, the 174th anniversary of the demise of Dr. George Robert Grasett. Dr. Grasett and his medical colleagues sacrificed their lives to help Irish famine migrants who arrived in Toronto in the summer of 1847. By a strange twist of fate, the creation of Dr. George Robert Grasett Park to commemorate his sacrifice and that of his colleagues in 1847 will now open during a new pandemic in Toronto in 2021. But we're reminded through their sacrifice and through the sacrifice and service of medical workers today of the timelessness of these extraordinarily brave and courageous medical professionals. Dr. George Robert Grasett was born in Lisbon in 1811, the son of a physician who served with General Wolseley in the Peninsular Wars. In 1814, his regiment, the 48th Regiment of Foot, was transferred to Quebec City, which would have been during the War of 1812 with the United States. Dr. Grasett followed in his father's footsteps, leading up to his first posting to Amherstburg in Essex County in southern Ontario, where he was in 1837-1838 during some disturbances brought on by raiders from the United States into Amherstburg. He tended the wounds of those who were captured during that engagement, and after a short period of time, he moves from Amherstburg to Toronto. He was much appreciated and admired by his patients in Amherstburg, who took up a collection to try and persuade him to stay, which he did for 2 years. But then, in response to his father's entreaties, he moved back to Toronto and took up residence with his older brother Henry Grasett, who was the Dean of St. James Cathedral at the time. So he was a very philanthropic individual, very kind, very charitable. He was the secretary of the Ontario Bible Society, and he devoted his time as a volunteer at the Toronto Dispensary, which was a medical facility for the indigent poor who had no money for medicine or for health care. And he also volunteered at the House of Industry. When word of the arrival of Irish migrants became widely known in late 1846 and early 1847, Dr. Grasett sought out the position as the attending surgeon in the Emigrant hospital and is appointed to that position in the middle of June 1847. Sadly, he dies of typhus on the 16th of July 1847 and is buried in St. James Cemetery on the following day, the 17th of July. Dr. Grasett, from what we know in his obituary and in some of the remarks and letters to his family after his death, was a very capable and highly respected medical practitioner. He had a wonderful, shall we say, bedside manner that was much appreciated by all who enjoyed treatment from him, both in the hospital and also in his general practice in Toronto. He was greatly missed. Sadly, he was forgotten very shortly after he gave up his life to help Irish migrants. So it's a wonderful pleasure, wonderful honour for our foundation to restore his name to memory and that of the other doctor, Dr. Joseph Hamilton, who died in November. Edward McElderry, a native of Newry in Ireland, he lost his life at the end of November as well. Nurse Susan Bailey, Nurse Sarah Duggan, Anne Slocum. Many of these were young women, very badly paid, working in ghastly circumstances in the hospital. They're extraordinary stories of courage, fortitude and endurance, and a great inspiration for us all.
The Grasett scrapbook is a very valuable item. It's huge. You can hardly lift it. It's heavy. It's this size, And there's a lot of medical history in it. There's a family of doctors. His father was a doctor, his brother was a doctor.
Dr. Grasett was the younger brother of Dean Henry Grasett of St. James Cathedral, who was a young 36-year-old doctor.
He had a medical practice in Toronto, but he also was doing volunteer work, and there was a clinic on Adelaide Street at the time, just by the church, and he would have donated his services to that. And he was became aware of the Irish situation.
So he volunteers, not only volunteers, but he lobbies through his brother to be appointed as the attending surgeon in the Emigrant hospital. So George Robert is appointed as the attending physician on the 18th of June, and he loses his life to typhus in July. But he was anxious to go to the aid of fellow citizens and new emigrants and new arrivals, many of whom didn't speak English. They would have spoken Gaelic. And they weren't all Anglican. Many of them, the vast majority of them, would have been Catholic. So at that time, that meant more than it does today. And he reached across the sectarian divide, a hand of friendship, a medical hand, a hand of kindness, and helped those people, and in the process lost his life.
And that's something that wasn't known. That's new knowledge. I mean, I lead tours with downtown Toronto. I have for years for ROM and so on. And you look at the statue outside St. Paul's Church, St. Paul's Catholic Basilica, and you see the monument outside to the bishop who died. And that's the only one we knew.
If you don't have a name, you're forgotten. And I think it's a very unfortunate scenario that somebody or a group of people who did such incredibly courageous work should be forgotten. It's part of our history. It's part of who we are.
Edward McElderry, we really don't know how to pronounce his name. It could be McElderry, it could be McElderry, but what we do know is that he was active in the civil service in Toronto and was one of the few Roman Catholics to be so. He would have been a member of Michael Power's congregation. Power would have known him, Power trusted him, and Power recommended him for the job of being the emigration agent in Toronto. McElderry's role is extremely important. He's the one who has to triage migrants as they arrive at the docks in Toronto, specifically Reese's Wharf, and understand the severity of this job and the importance, because in a town of almost 20,000 people, in the sailing season of June to October 1847, over 38,000 migrants arrive, almost twice the city's population. Most of them are Irish. Many are suspected or are discovered to have some sort of communicable disease, and it's McElderry's job essentially to triage the healthy ones out of the city and to triage the sick ones to the fever sheds that are eventually expanded at King and John at the Emigration Hospital. So McElderry is enormously important. He has Power's endorsement. And what happens to McElderry is rather tragic, because in late October, he himself dies of fever, leaving his wife, who is now pregnant, and 7 children practically destitute. And even though there are attempts made by Hawke, for example, and by others within the city to appeal to the Governor General to give Roseanne McElderry a pension, she's refused, and refused on the basis that many died in the service of the migrants during that year, and it would be a dangerous precedent to set. Even though she had 7 children and another on the way. And unfortunately, Power was already dead a month before McElderry, and so he couldn't advocate for the person that he had brought to the position. Michael Power was the first Bishop of Toronto. He was a Haligonian by birth, trained in Montreal, arrived in the city in 1842, and really had to create the whole infrastructure for the Catholic Diocese of Toronto. But during the famine period, he has a very unique role, because he's one of the few Torontonians actually to be in Ireland, where he was recruiting the Loretto sisters to come to Toronto. So he saw famine conditions firsthand in Ireland, and then returned home with the ability to warn those in the city of Toronto of the numbers that would be coming. Now, what he does when he's here here is, firstly, he calms down the population in terms of the alarm that had been set by the press both in the United States and in Ireland about the pending arrivals. Second thing is he asks people in Toronto to exercise their Christian charity, because the temptation was, as rumors of typhus being spread rapidly in places like Quebec City and Montreal were taking hold in Toronto, people were fleeing the city. And I think the third most important thing is he put his own life on the line. What happens is that Michael Power is almost alone as one of the few Catholic clergymen in that region of the country to visit the sheds not once but twice a day. And so he's setting, by his own example, Christian witness to helping those in need. And what happens to Power is that he contracts typhus himself in September of 1847 and dies on October the 1st, 1847. I think one of the great testaments to his example was the fact that when he was finally buried, it was the largest funeral cortege in the city's history. Catholic and Protestant all came out universally to tribute this individual, who eventually was buried in the crypt of the cathedral that he had begun but was not complete by the time he died.
Burlington Heights is a sand and gravel promontory, and it's to the northwest of the Hamilton town site proper. It is surrounded on one side by Hamilton Harbor, or Burlington Bay as it was known in the 19th century, and Coote's Paradise, which is a marshy wetland to the north and then to the west. It's very significant to the history of Hamilton and to the history of the province in general. It was a significant place for Indigenous peoples well into the early 19th century. Europeans started living there in the early 19th century, specifically a man named Richard Beasley. He was considered one of the first settlers of Hamilton, and he had property on Burlington Heights. And then Richard Beasley's time on Burlington Heights was interrupted by the British military, who took over Burlington Heights during the War of 1812. And they used it as a military encampment, a supply depot, probably a hospital there, a defensive position. And so if you go to Burlington Heights today, there are still mounds from the British defense position. Batteries and other structures remain of their defensive position. And so Burlington Heights was a place where the British military retreated to, but it was also a place where they launched the Battle of Stony Creek in 1813 and also the retaking of Fort George. After the British military left, they left behind the infrastructure, so barracks, remained, and also a cemetery. By the time the cholera epidemic came along in 1832 in Hamilton, the barracks became an ideal place for a cholera hospital, and the graveyard was then used in turn as a cholera cemetery. One historian said to me that at the time it was considered a waste ground for waste people. That's a pretty harsh way to put it, but I think there's a certain element of truth there. It makes sense that this is also where Irish immigrants who were strangers to the city and had also died from a potentially infectious or contagious disease would also be buried. That said, immigrants were buried at Christchurch Anglican Cemetery and at St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery, but at a very low number. And so it's interesting, it would be interesting to figure out what went into the decision. You know, why were certain very few immigrants buried at these church cemeteries, but the majority of them were buried at Burlington Heights.
My name's Brenda Sissons, and I live in Terrace, which is in northwest British Columbia. I'm about to read the letter written by Margaret Conlon, who was my great-great-grandmother. She was traveling with her husband and her 3 children aboard the ship Achilles originally from County Armagh, but they sailed out of Liverpool towards Canada. And she wrote this letter, I think around the 1st of May in 1847. My dear brother, with sore heart I now address you, a widow with 3 small children, and likely before you receive this I may give birth to another orphan. I do not know how to unfold my melancholy tale. About 10 o'clock on the 1st of May, my dear John went up to the head of the ship. A wave came up which left my children fatherless. All efforts were made, but he went to meet his God. And I am now destitute if you do not meet me at Mr. George H. White, Architect, Yonge Street, Toronto, who is to forward this letter to you. I do not intend stopping any place until I reach Toronto, and if you meet me there, neither I nor the children will be any burden on you. Little Benny is with a cough complaint, but is mending. There was a deal of sickness on the ship today, the 19th of May. The 19th person was committed to the deep. And God only knows what will be the consequence before we reach Quebec, which we expect to reach on Sunday the 1st. Nancy Hughes is also with us and has had bad health during the passage. I can tell you no more of my thoughts at present. I remain your affectionate sister-in-law, M. Conlon. And at the bottom she writes, I do not know my brother's directions. I have no address. So this letter was written by my great-great-grandmother anticipating her arrival in Quebec. And she did arrive in Quebec around the 24th of May, we think, shortly after she wrote that letter. But she and her two of her other children did not survive beyond Gros Isle, Quebec, where they landed. The son, Benny, we think, died of typhoid while he was still on the ship. There was a delay, I think, of about 2 weeks before the family was allowed to get off the ship from records that we've been able to find. And during that time span, Marianne Conlon, who was the oldest daughter in the family, became sick. The mother, I think, was admitted to the hospital to give birth, but either died in childbirth or she and the newborn baby died of typhoid very shortly after, which left only one little 5-year-old girl of the original family of 5, soon to become 6, who had left Ireland in May or April of 1847. So that little girl, between the time that the ship arrived and July 21st, became an orphan and was discharged into the care of the Lord Bishop of Montreal on July 21st at 5 years of age, being described as in delicate condition. That's the last record that we have of her until family history picks up the story and tells us that she was raised by a family called Mulholland in Hamilton and grew up with the Mulholland family and eventually at the age of 26 married Hiram DeWitt and became my great-grandmother, that little girl. So she and Hiram had 5 children altogether, 4 daughters and 1 son, and one of those daughters became my grandmother, Samina Rose DeWitt. And then one of her daughters, of course, became my mother. So that's what I know of my mother line. And I think what I find so poignant about this story is that little 5-year-old girl, the daughter of the woman who wrote this letter, is the beginning of my mother line in this country. And she was a little girl who had not only left the country that she knew and was raised in so far, but had lost her whole family, and yet somehow survived and grew up and became a mother herself, and is my ancestor, whom I don't know very much about, but I'm looking forward to learning more about, because she was obviously a survivor.
Hi, I'm Rosemary Kilbride Stanley, living in Mississauga, Ontario. I would like to share with you how important my Irish ancestors are to me. This autograph that you saw was one given to me by my aunt and written to her on the anniversary of his grandparents arriving on the Gaspé coast. Arthur, the author of this, was really proud also of having Irish ancestors. His grandparents arrived, Sarah and Patrick Kavanagh, in 1847. They were shipwrecked on the Gaspé coast. They had 6 children, 5 daughters and a son. Their son, the oldest, survived, and the 5 daughters drowned on that tragedy in 28th April 1847. I have the picture here of 4 generations. Sitting in the chair is Dominic, Sarah and Patrick's second son born in Canada, and standing behind him is his son Arthur, the author of that autograph, and the woman standing here to her father's right is my grandmother, Malvina Rifu, and my godmother, Aunt Roland. This 4 generations of Kavanaghs, and the Kavanagh name was very important to the entire family. I have written a play and have become really trying to piece together all the facts and bits and pieces of my ancestors' story. 8 years after arriving and having the tragedy of losing their 5 daughters, Patrick, on his way to a village across the bay, froze to death on a St. Patrick's Day, and Sarah was left alone with 3 young boys under the age of 6, 1 baby girl, 8 months old, and Martin, the oldest and the survivor of the Carricks, by then was 19. This story is one that really can tell you the strength and the courage that our ancestors lived.
Hello, my name is Jane Colley Murphy. We're here in St. Edward's Cemetery in Westport, Ontario, and I'm standing at the tombstone of my late husband's great-grandfather, Barney Murphy. Barney Murphy, along with his family, his mother, Bridget Mary McParlin, his father, John Murphy, his sister, Rose, his other sister, Catherine, and a brother, Patrick, and twin brothers were fleeing the famine in Ireland in 1849. They boarded a ship called the Hannah at Warren Point in North Armagh, and they set sail. It was quite a story about the actual condition of the ship, and as of all the ships that came during the famine, it was not what you would call a luxury liner. However, they did arrive at the mouth of the St. Lawrence. Unfortunately, they hit an ice floe. The ship was sinking. They got off. John Murphy put his 2 sons on an ice floe, and they floated away, and they never saw them again. Rose was so traumatized by this experience that she never spoke until she was 3 or 4 years old. Barney was 2 years old, and he was plucked out of the water by a lady called Mrs. Henry Grant, McEwen woman. She had lost all her 4 children and thought that Barney was hers, plucked him out, saved his life. Now, 10 or 12 of these families all settled on the mountain here in Westport, Ontario, and there are some descendants still living here. Now, this story we heard for the first time, my husband and I, the week of our wedding back in 1962, and we were very taken by it. My husband had a burning desire to do research, to go to Ireland, to find out what was all this about. And fortunately, he was able to meet up with a cousin, John Arthur Donnelly, and a lot of the blanks were filled in then. My husband, Patty, wanted to pass this on to his children, and as a result, they now know the story of their Irish ancestors on the Murphy side.
So my name is Mary Holmes. I live in Cantley, Quebec. It's also the same place that my great-grandparents came to from Ireland. During the Irish famine, our great-grandmother came on her own with her family. They all died on the way here except her, so she was the only one left when she arrived here. The great-grandfather who became her husband, he came, but we think he came in a family group with his first cousins and so on. And but they all arrived in Cantley. Catherine came up to visit Cantley, but she knew friends in Cantley at the time, and she came up to visit, met William, her husband-to-be, and and the rest is history, our history. So Catherine, her maiden name was Timlin. As far as we know, she married Francis O'Boyle in Ireland. They had children. As far as we know, Francis and the children died. She left Ireland with her own sister and her husband and their children. I've always been really inspired by Catherine and her story. She came here on her own by the time she got here. She had to, she had to go ahead, and as one of my aunts said, she had to go ahead because she couldn't go back. There was no way of going back to Ireland. There was nothing to go back to. But nevertheless, she did persevere, and she had hardship early in her life, as well as surviving the famine. She had survived her husband dying, her children dying because of it. She married here, and two of her children died as young people. So she wasn't, her suffering didn't stop. But nevertheless, she persevered, and she really wanted to know her descendants, to know her story, because she talked about it, and she left evidence, written evidence. She wrote a list of all the grandmothers and the great-grandmothers back about 5 or 6 generations from her. She didn't do the same thing for the men, but she did it for the women. But it was just her strength of character, and she was very dedicated. She was to her church and her religion too, and that, I'm sure, gave her great strength to carry on through everything she had to carry on through. So she's always been a really fine example for myself and for all the other young women in the family of just doing what you have to do and getting on with life,
Hello, my name is Terry Smith, and I am the descendant of a famine immigrant, Bridget Ann Tracy. Bridget Ann sailed on a famine ship in the summer of 1847. The ship's name was the Jane Black, and it sailed from Limerick. And this picture that you've been looking at is a picture of Bridget Ann when she was probably 25 years old. And it says a lot about what happened to Bridget Ann once she arrived in Canada, because when she came with her aunt and her sister, and they survived the journey across the sea, but arrived here with nothing and with very little clothing or very little resources, and eventually made their way to Whitby and lived there and grew up there and became a nurse. And this picture, I believe, is a really great image of what she has endured and what she gained as she came to Canada and lived here and developed a life for herself. So it makes me very proud to think that we are descendants of a woman who sailed on a famine ship in very terrible conditions and actually made a life here, married, had all kinds of children and descendants. And I hold here a little tiny jug that was given to our great-grandmother by one of her friends, and she was only 6 or 7 when she sailed on the ship, so her friend gave her this jug as a memory of Ireland. And this jug is now well over 160 years old and has sat in many curio cabinets and bookcases, and now resides in my sister Sheila's home, as she is the eldest descendant of all of the remaining descendants of our great-grandmother. And for me, it holds our heritage, it holds our history, and it holds the strength of what families go through when they immigrate, and is probably a good reflection of where our heritage and our history has come from.